The name Mankowitz is legendary in the movie business. It's not easy to write about two towering writer, director, producer brothers of 20th century Hollywood. Not easy to do this and have them be your relatives. Not easy to then integrate your own career as a writer, director, producer. But Nick Davis has managed to do all of that. His new book, Competing with Idiots, Herman and Joe Mankowitz, a dual portrait, is the result of these confluence of challenges. Herman was his grandfather, Joe his great uncle. There is the family lore, and then there is the Hollywood lore. Nick brings a wise eye to the integration, helping us rethink legacies that are both public and private. Nick has produced, written, and directed a slew of TV series and documentaries, including his latest 4-part series for ESPN titled Once Upon a Time in Queens about the 1986 Mets. Nick, it is my pleasure to welcome you to Just the Right Book.
Thank you, Roxanne. It's great to be here.
So we should tell everybody so that they're not, that we're disclosing everything, that we're friends.
We know each other.
We know each other.
Yeah.
So if I seem unusually flattering of you, people should understand that that's related to the relationship.
It's okay.
Okay,
Yeah,
good.
good.
All right, good. So, there's a very public notion of Herman and Joe Mankowitz. And just so that we sort of like lay the groundwork, describe, how would they be described publicly?
Well, that's an interesting question to ask me because I grew up with a different notion of who they were.
Exactly, but we're going to start.
So publicly, Herman was a larger-than-life screenwriter who was one of the funniest and wittiest and smartest men around, and one of the first wave of screenwriters out to Hollywood from New York City, where he'd been a journalist and member of the Algonquin Round Table and wrote for The New Yorker, and then became a highly paid screenwriter in Hollywood, but kind of famously self-destructive and, lived a short, full life, drinking himself into an early grave at the age of 55. His younger brother, Joe, 11 and a half years younger, came out to Hollywood just a few years after Herman and had a sort of steady, ultimately, I don't want to say meteoric, but it was a steady rise to success at the top of the Hollywood game. First, as he was told by Louis B. Mayer, you have to walk before you can run. He was a producer and produced a number of very well-known movies like Philadelphia Story and Fury and Woman of the Year. Then became a writer-director, and his towering achievement was All About Eve. But he had a number of other very successful movies in the 50s and 40s and 60s until Cleopatra, which sort of was a turning point in his career in a not great way. But he ended on a high note with the movie Sleuth in 1972. For which he liked to joke, his entire cast was nominated for Academy Awards, both Michael Caine and Laurence
there were
Olivier.
two people,
yeah,
right?
two people in the movie. So that publicly was who Herman and Joe were. And
Right.
if you were, say, a young kid in New York City in the 70s and you went into a bookstore and you flipped to the back of a movie book, Joe had a lot more pages on his more credits and more mentions in the back of the book than Herman, who usually had 3 or 4 mentions in the back of the book. So that's who they were publicly.
Yeah, and is my notion that Herman was the more dominant name? I mean, because I wouldn't consider myself a film buff, but somehow, even before I knew you and John Mankowitz, Herman was the name that I thought of because somehow Citizen Kane...
Well, Citizen Kane was such a towering achievement.
Yeah.
And in the early 70s, Pauline Kael wrote an essay that became a book, Raising Kane, that resurrected Herman's reputation. I would say until then, he was more of an afterthought for most Hollywood history. But she resurrected him and and said, hey, no, everyone gives Orson Welles all the credit, but here's the guy who wrote the screenplay. And that became very controversial. He maybe Herman didn't write all of it, and then it became the basis of last year's David Fincher movie.
Right.
So Herman has now, I would say, I mean, somebody should check those Google things where any
Like who searches how many.
Yeah, and see who is getting searched for more.
We should do that now.
Yeah. But I would say that Herman's reputation has gone up just in terms of name recognition.
Yeah.
But Joe had he
had a bigger portfolio,
a much bigger, much more, ultimately more successful career, and in a family that cared a lot about success. That mattered for a lot, at least in Joe's mind, and sort of that dictated the terms of their relationship in a lot of ways.
But now let's get to the family part.
Right.
So how did Herman and Joe loom in the family?
Well, in the family, at least on Herman's side, and my mother was Herman's daughter.
Right.
So when I was growing up, Herman was the guy. He was the funniest man who ever lived, the smartest man who ever lived. He was incredibly warm and deeply compassionate, but also a hilarious screw up and, doomed, but in a fascinating way, and drank himself into an early grave. But, oh, by the way, because he thought all the work was beneath him, he wrote the greatest movie of all time, Citizen Kane. So that's Herman, and he died 12 years before I was born.
Yeah.
So that was the guy. That was the hero in my mind.
So he did Citizen Kane in what year?
1940.
1940, and he died in 53,
yeah, he
right?
died in 53.
Yeah. Okay.
And there was a sort of graceful decline in Herman's career from the sort of peak when he first got out to Hollywood in 26.
Where he was like a wonder kid.
He was a wonder kid, and he was, making more money than anybody and gambling it all away, and a lot of boom and bust and all that, and then eventually fired from nearly every studio. And there's the great line where he was fired from one studio, and they said, not only are you fired from here, we're going to make sure you never work at any studio in town. And he said, promises, promises.
I know. I love that. I saw that in the book.
That's one of my favorites. But then he just, he thought that movies were crap. And so the work was beneath him, and he should have been doing something else, but he wasn't sure what. And he, the money was so good and the weather was so nice that he just stayed out there. Joe took it all very seriously.
He was a good dog.
Yeah, and he thought, no, Hollywood is great, and movies are the art form, the dominant art form of the 20th century, and I'm going to study them and learn how to be good at it. And as Herman is going down, a decline that somehow was not really altered by Citizen Kane in the middle of it, Joe was on his ascent, and the two men sort of crossed paths. And the little brother, who Herman routinely derided as my idiot brother, passed him. And so that's sort of what happened. But so in my family, I mean, when I was a kid, Joe was, he was responsible for Cleopatra, the biggest bomb in Hollywood history, and he nearly sank a studio. And so there was like shame attached to him in my young mind.
Yeah.
If no one else's. And then for a long time he wasn't writing, and he had this 20-year case of writer's block after Sleuth. And so there was sort of like, well, Herman was great, but Joe wasn't. And that's a very cartoonish view of two very complicated men, but that's what I grew up with until I started investigating who they really were.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. And then to indulge in pop psychology, there were two defining things about them. One is Franz, their father, who was, unloving, high expectations, the classic line that you talk about, one of the kids got a 97 and Franz wanted to know what happened to the 3 points. And then Herman and Joe became fiercely competitive, right?
I think there was a moment when they became fiercely competitive. Initially, Herman was
paved the way, right?
Herman paved the way, and when Joe wasn't sure what he wanted to do after college, Herman said, "For Christ's sake, come to Hollywood! Like, come on, this is easy money and it's fun." And so Joe came out there, and I think gradually Herman started to realize, wait a minute, this guy, first of all, he's not letting me borrow money anymore. Like when he was first there, Herman was just borrowing money from his little pisher of a brother anytime
Because
he wanted.
Herman was gambling constantly.
Constantly.
Yeah.
And thought that whatever the little brother had belongs to the older brother. And so I think Herman gradually realized, wait a minute, this guy is really ambitious, and Herman didn't like, he didn't like the town, and he didn't like the people he was competing with. I mean, the title of the book, Competing with Idiots, comes from this famous telegram that Herman sent to his friend Ben Hecht when he first got out to Hollywood, and it said, will you accept $300 per week to come out to Paramount Pictures? There's millions to be grabbed out here, and your only competition is idiots. Don't let this get around. Knowing that that would start the flood of New Yorkers out to Hollywood to make easy money. And the first wave of the screenwriters didn't take any of it very seriously. But the second wave, and Joe was a part of that, sort of was like, well, wait a minute. This could be an actual life and career, not like my good work is the stage or novels or journalism or something. No, this will be my career, and I'll be great at it and take it seriously. So Herman didn't like those people, and Joe was one of them.
Well, and one of the things that was striking to me, and I'll jump ahead a little bit, is the degree to which Herman had disdain and considered himself superior. And there were some, some of the witticisms are worth the price of admission to the book, but the disdain and the fact that that Herman continued to do it and Joe continued to do it. Am I reading too much into it that took a toll on them? That they felt that they never became the writer for the New York. At one point, your grandfather thought he'd be the critic for the New Yorker when somebody retired. Or do you think that took a toll on them?
Yeah, absolutely. Herman always felt uncomfortable in his own skin and wanted to be somewhere else. He thought, I should be back in New York. I mean, there's a great line when he comes and visits New York in the late 30s, sort of maybe planning a return, where he says, to be back in Hollywood, wishing I were back in New York. Like, there was just this feeling like he wasn't where he should be. He should be writing a novel. He should be a Walter Lippmann-type political columnist. And he never escaped. He was trapped there, and because the money was too good, and maybe he just couldn't make peace with the fact that he was really good at it. He was a really terrific screenwriter. Not everybody can write Citizen Kane. And, unfortunately, he never kind of accepted that was going to be his path.
Or worthy.
Yeah, or that was a worthy path. Because Franz, as you said, their father, Franz, is stern German immigrant, academic, disciplinarian. I think, somewhat typical for the time, would never tell his children that he loved them, even though I think he did. And, you can't live up to that man's standards, so you're not even going to try. I think Joe did kind of escape. I mean, Joe got out of Hollywood and moved to New York and after the success of All About Eve and the previous year, Letter to Three Wives, he won Oscars for writing and directing 2 consecutive years, which nobody is ever going to break. Maybe somebody will tie it, but it's not going to be broken. And I think so Joe got back to New York, and he did think, I've got to write a play now. But why? I mean, these guys
And he never did.
No, he never really did.
He never did.
No, he never did.
So, Nick, the other thing that was, there was a scene in the book. There's a couple of parts that I could read about the difference between Herman and Joe. But when Franz retired, moved out to L.A., and shortly thereafter became very ill and was dying, I found the scene with Herman's reaction to Franz's dying and death, and Joe to have epitomized the difference between them, despite Herman's self-destructiveness and Joe's industriousness.
Mm.
So describe what that was like.
Well, yeah, Franz came out for a visit and had a stroke and was in the hospital for, I think, a week. And during that week, Herman was by his bedside all the time. Now, part of that, as my grandmother pointed out, is that he didn't want to go to work, so he'd rather be.
Oh, I don't want to hear
No,
that.
but, I think that's true. And
I think Sarah was making that up.
no, but I look, he loved his dad, and he wanted to be there for him, and he held his hand and talked to him endlessly, and was with him. And Joe came once and stayed for half an hour and had a visit and left. And you could look at that and think, gee, it's so cold on Joe's part. But interestingly, my cousin Ben Mankowitz, also a member of the clan,
Right.
Looks at that scene and thinks, yeah, but you know what? He wasn't going to get anything from his father, and he'd already made peace with the fact that his father was an unloving jerk to him. So why try? And therefore Joe had work to do. So he got back to the office, and it's not what when I first got to that scene, I thought, it's so cold on Joe's part. But I think there's something in some ways perhaps more evolved than trying to get blood from a stone, which is what Herman was doing. Like, oh, Pop, I love you, Papa. You're not going to get it. You're not going to get some kind of emotional catharsis closure from Franz Mankowitz.
But Herman, despite his self-destructiveness, was a mushpot.
He was a mushpot, yes, if I understand that word.
I don't think
he
Herman
had a huge heart and was so loving and a screw up, but you forgave him for everything. And one of the incredible things, just for me as a person, was I got to listen to an interview my mother did, and my mother passed away when I was 9. So obviously that is tied up in the germination of this book.
We'll get to this.
Yeah. But so I listened to my mom try and describe to Herman's first biographer, Richard Merriman, on a tape in the 70s. She's talking about, like, none of the facts would make you think this was a great dad. He gambled, he was embarrassing, he belched, he farted, he
threw up.
Maybe she didn't see him throw up, but I mean, he was just sort of a mess.
Probably she did.
Yeah, he came to, the basketball game with a transistor radio because he had a lot of money on the Kentucky Derby. I mean, this is not who you want as a father, but somehow, she says, you forgave him for it. And so, and she says, this is what you can't get at. You can't get at this. But somehow his humanity was so huge and real that, his actions were not those of a mensch, but his heart was. And Joe did not give that sense to anybody.
Yeah, so speaking of Joe, I was struck by the dichotomy that you talk about in the book, that Joe had this capacity to spot a troubled actress. We could talk about Judy Garland. He developed a reputation for listening to them and being there for them in a way that made them devoted to him, yet he was generally disliked.
Yeah, he was more disliked in some ways by his family than
the industry.
The industry respected him, and his actors really liked him, and he was great with actors. And I think he was a tremendously good listener for a director, and gave his actors and actresses a feeling that he was there for them. There's no rush. He wasn't somebody who yelled action. He was like, whenever you're ready. He got them comfortable, and he was incredibly sensitive. I mean, his screenplays are so sensitive and so psychologically astute that it's not fair to say, oh, he was mean and cold. Like, his family, in particular, his two sons in the 40s and 50s, Chris and Tom, didn't feel like he was really ever listening to them. Now, Tom made his peace with it much more than Chris, and joined his father on movie sets and stuff, and eventually became a very successful screenwriter in his own right. But Joe didn't give the feeling in a personal relationship so much that he was really listening and interested in you, unless you were interested in him and his career or whatever. I think he was generally decently liked in the industry, and agents and producers and those people liked him. Although every once in a while you come across a story where his ambition just shines through in such a shocking way that, Billy Wilder backstage at the Academy Awards, was famously chatting with him, and they were just, gosh, Billy, even to be included in the company of you and these people is so great. They've both been nominated that year, Billy Wilder for Sunset Boulevard, and then they call Joe's name to win the award, and he just shoots by Billy Wilder, cuts him off
with no regard,
and no sort of like, oh, this is awkward. Excuse me, I got to go get the award. I mean, and Billy Wilder was like, I had never seen anything like that naked ambition before, which makes you think, well, did you never see All About Eve? Because that's a portrait of it, and part of what is so chilling and great about that movie is how ambition is so incarnate in it. Eve Harrington.
So I want to go to. There were a couple of pieces I was going to read about, but I'm going to skip that. Well, I'll come back to this, but let's talk about the movies. Let's talk about Citizen Kane and All About Eve.
All right.
So in preparation for this interview, I rewatched, Kevin and I, my husband and I, rewatched Citizen Kane, and I, for the first time, watched All About Eve. So I came away with two questions and an observation. One is, how were they groundbreaking? Because one of the things that I was very struck by was how the voiceovers were done in both of those films, to a very different effect. But the voiceovers, was that groundbreaking? But watching All About Eve, to me, I don't think I've ever seen a movie where every line is incredibly constructed, smart, clever, observing. I mean, I just could not. I mean, I sound like an idiot because I know it won 14 nominations and 4 for nomination for all the women that were in it and all that. But how were they groundbreaking movies?
Well, I mean, Citizen Kane was groundbreaking in so many ways, and a lot of that is not Herman. A lot of that is Orson Welles. I think the screenplay was groundbreaking because its structure is, if you study it, it's incredible. It's the overlapping, as you say, the overlapping voiceovers and the flashbacks and flash forwards are, to this day.
That was new.
Yeah, that was new. I mean, they had done certain things like that. Actually, Fury, which was a film that Joe had produced for Fritz Lang, Fury experimented with stuff like that. And there were, it had been done, sort of hinted at, but nobody, start a movie, you flashback, and you catch up to the flashback. That's sort of standard. But the myriad of stops and starts and coming back and seeing things from a different angle, not to mention the newsreel, which was just brilliant.
Oh my God.
And that's Herman's entirely. Because he lived for the newspapers and Henry Luce speak and that kind of stuff. I think that the screenplay is totally groundbreaking in such a way so that I've seen the movie so many times, but every time I watch, I'm never entirely sure what's going to come next.
Really?
Yeah, because you're sort of like, oh, right, now we're getting to Joseph Cotten sitting in there, with the blanket over his knees. I mean, there's so many great things, and the dialogue is great. But
Jedediah.
I
love that.
Yeah. Well, a white dress she had on. I mean, it's great. All About Eve, Joe came to love and almost patent voiceover and flashbacks. So he did it himself. He did it in A Letter to Three Wives. He did it in Barefoot Contessa. He did it in...
George Saunders did it as Addison. And
Yeah.
Right.
He starts it. But to me, I agree with you. I mean, I think every line is like a gem. It's so well crafted and it's so theatrical.
I want to read it.
And because it's about, it's a great, it is a great screenplay. Not just structurally, but every line is so good. I think that the structure of Citizen Kane is more revolutionary, but the lines in All About Eve, it's about time the piano realizes it hasn't written the concerto. There's so many great lines that it's delicious. And I think because it's about theater, Joe was able to sort of infuse a theatrical sort of archness into the dialogue that he gets away with.
And it was tight.
Yeah, it's really tight.
It was really tight.
Yeah.
But after I watched the movie, I did what, I went down the All About Eve rabbit hole. I'm looking up how old was Betty Davis when she did it. Oh, she was 42. And she married Gary Merrill, who plays her love interest right after the movie. Oh, so the movie did that.
Yeah, the movie got them together.
Celeste Holm wasn't talking to Betty. I mean, I was...
That's good.
I'm addicted now.
That's good.
Now I want to go, but I really want to read the screenplay because the language. I'm a more of a reader than a film person, and to me, the language. Although I fell in love with Betty Davis.
She's amazing. She is amazing, and I don't know. Originally Claudette Colbert was cast.
Which would have been a very different creature.
Very different creature, much less... I mean, I'm sure she could have risen to those sort of theatrical heights that Betty Davis does, but I don't know that it would have been as...
and the hair.
Yeah, the hair is great. And, her face covered in that oil of whatever it is when she's
taking
her
off her makeup.
It's so incredible. And I think because Claudette Colbert looks so much like Anne Baxter, it would have been more clear what's happening here. And the relationship between the two women would have been more obviously, potentially sibling-like. Whereas in the actual movie it isn't. But as I'm just going to go ahead and say it.
Yeah,
it is my belief.
Well, it's Jane's belief first.
It is Jane's
your
belief.
wife,
Yes,
who's a wonderful novelist.
Thank you. So my wife, Jane Mendelsohn, and I were watching the movie All About Eve.
I'm not sure I'm buying this theory, but you go with it.
Yeah, well, certainly there are many people who do not buy this theory, including Joe. But this is a movie about a younger artist who is usurping and taking down the older artist, and the younger is cold, scheming, ambitious, calculating, and the older is beloved and charismatic and self-destructive. So it is this theory goes
hard not to.
It's hard not to think. Well, maybe Joe unconsciously is drawing on his
screw
relationship.
You, Herman.
Yeah, is drawing on his relationship between. With Herman in writing the screenplay. It doesn't mean he was consciously thinking about it, but those were impulses, I believe, and feelings that he was drawing on when he wrote the screenplay.
But Nick, ironically, the film is more sympathetic to the self-destructive person than to the than to Eve. Yeah, if that's Joe.
Yeah, no. Well, Joe's a brilliant artist. I mean, I think that first of all, he denied that these were autobiographical impulses.
All right.
And I think maybe if he had, he would have gotten messed up and not written such a great movie. No, I think also he was the younger brother who loved and idolized his older brother when he was growing up.
And
Herman defended him against Franz and stuck up for Joe and would fight Franz bitterly while Joe hid in the closet, terrified that his father was going to, tear his brother's head off.
Yeah.
And Herman didn't have his head torn off. He gave as good as he got and protected his brother. And so Joe loved Herman for much of his life. And only later realized, well, gee, this guy, he's got a lot of problems and I can't be like that. I don't want to drink. I don't want to gamble. I'm going to take my career seriously and stop biting the hand that feeds me and stop insulting people and throwing up at dinner parties and all the things that Herman did that made him so beloved, but also self-destructive. So I think it's very complicated, but I do think that Joe had a huge heart and did love Herman, and as he loved Margot Channing, Betty Davis.
But let's pivot, because you open the book with a very, very unflattering picture of Joe. Yeah. And so I'd like you to ask you to share that story. And then why'd you open with that?
Well, It's a good.
I know it's a good opening.
It's a
You've
good
got
opening.
all the. I got it. But why?
Because it was the inciting incident for the book, for me to write the book. It was the mystery. It was Rosebud.
Okay,
You
so
know,
tell the
it's-
story and then tell us how that was the string you pulled for.
Yeah. So, as I said before, I grew up with these very cartoon-like ideas of who these two guys were. And so when in 1988, as a young man, my dad, I was called by my dad. I hate to have a dangling modifier on a podcast about books. My dad calls me up and says, hey, you know, they're honoring Uncle Joe at the French consulate, your Uncle Joe at the French consulate. Do you want to go watch? They're giving him an award. And I thought, the guy who did Barefoot Contessa, I saw
Cleopatra?
that. Yeah, Cleopatra. All right, I'll go. I mean, you know, the French, you know, Jerry Lewis. I mean, so, you know, I was such a snob and arrogant little twit. But I went, and I hadn't met Joe more than once or twice, and certainly not since my mom's funeral 13 or 14 years earlier. And he was great. He was warm and loving and funny and self-deprecating, and he reminded me of my Uncle Frank, who I love. And I just was like, I don't understand. Why did we never see this guy?
And he lived right in New York.
Yeah, we lived an hour away, and we just never saw him. So that is when my dad tells me the story that begins the book, which is that in 1958, my mother was 20, and she had sort of periodically, and her great Uncle Joe, or Uncle Joe, had been a great uncle, a terrific uncle. And it put
Met his commitment to Herman, paid for college,
sent her
grand
to Europe,
tour,
grand tour, the whole thing, and been terrific. And when she was first starting out her life in New York, she would come over and sort of be a kind of hostess for him at his dinner parties when his wife wasn't up to it. His wife, Rosa Strodner, had been an actress and a very frustrated actress who did not become Greta Garbo and instead became a sort of frustrated housewife. And they had a very tempestuous relationship. So one afternoon, Joe calls up my mom and says, you know, I can't reach Rosa up at Mount Kisco. Why don't you come up and let's drive up and see what's going on? So this was a Saturday, and my mom, finished shopping. And then they drove up to Mount Kisco, which is an hour away, and they get to the house, and Joe says, why don't you check upstairs? I'll look down here. And so she goes up and finds the dead body of her aunt, who has committed suicide. And I think it took a while, it took a few years for her to realize, wait a minute.
He knew.
He knew. Or if he didn't know, he suspected. And if he suspected, why is he sending his 20-year-old niece into that situation?
Yeah.
And so she felt used and manipulated and abused by that. And, you know, when I was 23 and I heard that story, I thought, oh, what an asshole. All right, fine. So that's why we never saw him. And it took me a long time to realize, well, wait a minute. Okay, maybe. But what drives a man to that? I mean, was he so competitive with Herman that 5 years after the guy has died, drunk himself into an early grave, you're so angry or still so...
You're taking it out on...
That you're going to take it out on your niece? Or maybe that's totally wrong, and maybe it's just innocent, and he was, like, nervous, and he just wanted some company on the ride, and he thought, you know, she probably stuck her head in the oven, I'll check the kitchen. You know, I mean, there's a lot of...
possibilities.
There's a lot of possibilities. It's a lot more complicated than I, as a 23-year-old, thought. But that is where I begin the book, because that was the incident that set me on the journey of thinking, wait a minute, who are these two guys? What is this relationship? Who was Franz to have set them on this competitive path? What does all this competition do to a person? And is it really fair to think that everyone else is an idiot who you have to compete with? Or is maybe the competition itself what turns you into an idiot? So all of those things came from that first scene, which, yes, it's true. It doesn't make Joe look good. It's tough to come back from that if you're Joe.
Yeah.
But I came to love Joe writing the book.
Did you?
Oh, yeah. Far more than
But I want to
had
see
when he
if
was
I
actually
can
alive.
find... well, and you rarely saw him, right?
Yeah, we never saw him. I don't think I saw him again after the French consulate. I saw him one other time. There was a Lincoln Center thing. And again, he was warm and lovely. to me, and then he died, and I went to his funeral, and that was it.
Oh, I wonder if you would. I thought this was really interesting. Joe, this is at your parents' wedding.
Mm.
And Joe escorted your mom down the aisle to the rabbi after he told them to like turn around, that the bride and groom should be facing the audience, and who wants to see the rabbi.
Yeah. Nobody, we're not here to see you. Turn around. We want to see your back, and we want to see the bride and groom.
Yeah. And Joe was not, maybe this is not the fair description, the way he wasn't as enthusiastic as Josie would have liked. Josie's your mom's name, about Peter, your dad, Peter Davis.
No.
Years later, she would describe her husband, who himself employed a jaw clench, not unlike her uncle's, as always looking like he had just stepped from a bracing shower, ready to move forward into the world, to attack, to achieve. And of course, Johanna Mankowitz knew that some people weren't in fact like that. And this was a line that, so you wrote, it's not a quote, some people are happy with what they have. They don't push and prod and seek always the next big thing, the next accomplishment, book, novel, assignment, job, movie. They take what is given to them and form their lives cheerfully and without complaint. So how defining do you think Joe being that way, and maybe Herman, was to you? Because it's a theme through the book. And were you surprised about discovering that or understanding that? Or was that always clear to you?
Well, it wasn't clear to me that everybody didn't have that. I assumed that's the way the world works, and of course you'd think that. And yeah, I mean, for the longest time, I didn't see the problem with Franz saying, "Where are the 3 points?"
Where are the 3 points?
Yeah, where are the 3 points?
My father did that.
Yeah, and it's not, Franz, I think, did it without humor, but I think that. No, I assumed, you compete. What's the problem with competing? And you try to be the best. What else would you try to be?
Yeah.
And what's the next thing? What's the next assignment? What's the next job? What's the next movie? What are you working on? I mean, that's the stuff of life, right?
Yeah.
And it took me a long time to realize, no, wait a minute, there's actually a perennial wisdom that speaks to something deeper than that. And there are people who understand that and don't do that and live their lives cheerfully and happily. And it's in my mother's book. My mother wrote a novel called Life Signs. And you can tell in the book that she was grappling with the same issue. And there's I think I excerpt it at the start of one of the parts, where she realizes that, and she's going to let go of this and just be happy. And so I think that, but it's it takes a long time if you come from Franz Mankowitz, or frankly Peter Davis. I think my dad had a similar
same
kind
thing
of thing
from his father, Frank.
Well, I don't know. I haven't actually talked to my dad that much about.
Let's do that.
Let's do that next time.
Let's take him down.
Let's do. I mean, I think that. But I think it's the American way. I mean, it's not just hardworking immigrants. I mean, I think it's a lot of people feel like, what have you done for me lately?
So, Nick, speaking of your mom's book, Life Signs, so John Mankowitz had sent it to me, which I devoured it. I mean, I think it's such a fantastic book, and I'm like dying to see it republished. Like, to me, she was Nora Ephron first, in reading. Well, to me.
Don't get me started.
Yeah.
Okay? I mean,
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I totally agree.
So the question, Nick, I would logically have for you, you were 9 when your mom died?
Yeah.
To what extent did reading that book inform you about your mother? Or did it?
No, I think it definitely did. I didn't read it that often, but I always found it, useful and helpful when I did.
Such a great book.
Yeah.
I'm going to say it. I just love that book.
Well, the voice is so strong
It's
that
fabulous.
you feel her presence, so you do get to know her.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it, I think, what makes it great is her voice, and it comes through. But it's, it's complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course it is. So that makes me ask you this question, is how is the book you set out to write different from the book that we have?
Well, I think I would answer that by saying I never wanted to write this book.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't going to write this book. This book was going to be written while I didn't think about it.
I mean, you did spend 20 years
well,
like working on it.
Yeah. So what happened was I mean, first of all, with relatives like these, you decide, well, I'm not a writer, that's for sure, because I can't compete with this guy. This guy, Herman, he was, wrote the greatest movie of all time and drank himself into an early grave because he hated what he did. So you shouldn't probably be a writer because you're never going to be able to compete with this guy who was self-destructive anyway.
Yeah.
Not to mention Joe and my mother and so...
And your father and your grandfather.
Well, yeah, my father is a filmmaker.
Yeah.
And so I decided I'll be a filmmaker, and went into filmmaking and then in the spring of 2002, yes, 20 years ago, I went to American Masters and I said, hey, I have this theory. I don't think I credited my wife in this meeting. I have this theory about All About Eve. And I told the woman at American Masters, Susan Lacey, here's who Joe was, here's who Herman was. I think there'd be a great documentary here about these two guys. You get the clips. And she was like, great, what a terrific idea. Let's do a little development deal. She gave me a teeny bit of money. I started researching and interviewing my cousins and my uncles in audio only. She didn't give me enough money for cameras.
Yeah.
And then that Christmas, I was at a party and mentioned this to an agent, a friend of mine who's an agent, happens to be a book agent. And he said, well, do a companion book. And I thought, yes, a companion book. I won't really be writing it. It'll write itself while I'm doing this documentary. And sure enough, the documentary goes away. Clips are too expensive. And I'm left with this book contract. And this book I did not want to write. But I couldn't walk away because you can't walk away from a project like this. You can't walk away from your family. And if it had been the Coen brothers or something, I might have been able to, find the hundreds of dollars I'd gotten for the advance and given it back. But so I started work on the book, and it was very boring. It was very, very dull. It was like the first draft was like a Wikipedia entry about these two guys, because I was trying to be objective and be impartial. And
But it was your grandfather and your...
Yeah, but it just was not good at all. And then I had this, what I thought was, it was an insight, but I took it too far, which was, I thought, okay, it's not going to be a biography of these two guys. It'll be a biography of three guys, Herman, Joe, and Nick. And so I wrote my story into it, and I wove together with all these fascinating to me parallels between their careers and my career.
Well, of course.
All of this stuff. And I gave it to I finished it and gave it to my editor. And she said, okay, this is what you had to do in order to write it. Now take yourself out of it. I'm not interested in Nick alongside Herman and Joe. So I took myself out of it after a year of trying not to.
Yeah.
And I read it one afternoon and I saw, aha, that's it. The book now has a voice. It has a perspective. This is
But it's about them.
And it's about them, but it's coming from me. And it's important to me that it doesn't, it's not a dual biography. It's a dual portrait. It's I
loved using that word.
Well, because it's my version of those two guys, and other people can and have. David Fincher did a movie. That's his version of Herman, and Joe too. And I think that's great. So I'm not pretending that this is the only way to see these guys. I'm saying this is the way I see these guys. I've done a lot of research. I believe I'm right in a sort of holistic way about who Joe was, who Herman was, what their relationship was. But other people can come to their own opinions if they want to do the research or just read this book and then rewrite it.
So Nick, the logical question, which has 4 parts, is how did the process of writing the book change what you thought of Joe or Herman, how did it change what you thought of your mother? How did it change how you thought about yourself?
Well,
I know that's a small question.
Yes,
But
yes,
Nick,
no, and yes.
I want an answer.
That's a great question. These are all great questions, Roxanne. You're a very astute reader. I think that it deepened my relationships with all of those four people.
Yeah.
In particular, well, all of them. I mean, Herman. I went in loving Herman, so Herman had the advantage going in. I wouldn't say that but I came to really. I mean, I would get very frustrated with Herman sometimes, which had never happened to me before, because you're out there and you're working on these movies that are now considered classics, and you think the work is beneath you. It's just so tragic. Now,
tragic is the right word.
Yeah, I understand that the people were not. He was brilliant, and so I understand that people were not.
But he was also arrogant.
Yeah.
Or a snob. He was a snob. He was a snob. I don't know if he was arrogant.
Yeah.
He was a snob.
Yeah, he certainly thought he was better than they were, and he probably was. I mean,
yeah.
but it didn't help him to think that way, and so I think Joe had the farthest to come. In my mind, and he did. I think that I came to have enormous sympathy for Joe, even though he behaved badly and was a terrible husband, at least to the first two wives. And he wasn't. He was a good husband to his third
Rosemary.
wife. Yeah. And I think that Joe, the final 20 years of his life were not happy ones professionally, but he had settled into a kind of peace. And ultimately, I think he really
more
did.
than your grandfather ever did.
Oh,
certainly.
yeah. And certainly at the end of his life, in the final couple of months, I think he did reconcile with himself and with his father, and came to accept, hey, I did some good things, which he had never done before.
Which is a lot. If you come from that kind of family, that's not easy.
Yeah, but even as late as the late 80s, he's getting called from the Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, which is where he grew up. Film festival, and they say, hey, we want to do a film festival honoring you, and he's like, oh, great, and your brother Herman will do a Herman and Joe, and he's absolutely not. And he's like, come on, man, just share it. It's like if Paul McCartney said, no, we're not doing any Beatles stuff, it's just Paul McCartney now. It's like that kind of but you were a Mankowitz, and Herman was your brother, and you did love him, so why not say, gosh, unconsciously, maybe Herman played a role in my writing All About Eve. That only makes the movie richer, But no, absolutely not. He told his biographer, no, Herman had nothing to do with it. I had nothing to do with Citizen Kane. Come on, man. And for someone who cared so much about psychology, he
was really into analysis and all of that.
He got Judy Garland into analysis, and he cared so much about it that it's weird that when it, came to himself, he was unwilling to look at himself. So that's how my relationship with Joe changed and deepened. And then my mom, there were moments when I felt like, because I was listening to her voice on tape, which I was intense.
Wow.
Yeah. And hearing her unwrap, the cellophane from a box of cigarettes, where you're just like, oh, I didn't even know I knew that sound. And now I'm hearing it, and it's her.
That's crazy.
And the drag on the cigarette, and also her voice, which had it's almost not patrician, but there was something like you could hear the Wellesley in her voice,
Yeah.
And so that was very intense. And then reading her book and being, excerpting her book, there were times when I felt like she's my most reliable interviewee for the sections that deal with her life. I'm collaborating with her, and it was very intense feeling.
Wow.
Yeah. And then,
Nick, how cool is that?
It was very cool. And so my relationship with myself, I would say, here's a thing you didn't want to do that was a homework assignment for 20 years hanging over your head.
Yeah.
And, well, you finished it. Yeah, it's pretty good. Like, I feel like good. I hope people like it and read it and accept it.
It was we didn't get to a lot of the, I loved learning about F. Scott Fitzgerald being a crummy screenwriter and a great, as opposed to...
Yeah, that's another reason Joe had sort of a checkered...
He fired
F. Scott Fitzgerald, and he worried for a long time that was going to be on his epitaph, he's the guy who fired F. Scott Fitzgerald. who in turn called him Monkey Bitch. So, you know,
I love that chapter.
Yeah, Monkey Bitch. I was very happy.
So
when I
speaking
saw
of
that.
Monkey Bitch,
Yeah.
I am really taken about this idea that you ended up collaborating with your mom. That's pretty cool.
Well, it's a little oogie boogie.
No, but I'll go
yeah,
with it.
Yeah,
I like it.
Yeah,
I'm going to go with it.
Yeah, I mean,
I've
really,
read her book.
Okay,
So,
good.
yeah, I'm going to go with that.
Okay, fine.
So there you were on a panel with 3 of your cousins recently about the benefits and burdens of being a mankowitz.
I actually wasn't on that panel.
Oh, you weren't?
I wasn't on that panel because my last name is not Mankowitz.
Oh, that's right.
So John.
That's right.
Yeah,
It was John, Josh, Ben, and Alex.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Alex was Joe's daughter from his 3rd marriage.
Right.
Right?
Right.
That's right. So on being a Mankowitz, because you're a Davis.
Yeah.
But you're a Mankowitz.
Yeah.
Just not by name.
Yeah.
So what you had that being a Mankowitz, plus you have, as we talked about, you have your dad who's won awards and your grandfather on the Davis side, who was very accomplished screenwriter. Does it feel like more like a benefit or a burden? I mean, does it feel like a lot to live up to? Does it feel like an advantage? It's obviously a great gene pool.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it is a great gene pool. It's certainly a great gene pool. It is a lot to live up to. I think that...
Did it make you nervous to...
I think it was so baked in that I didn't notice it for a long time.
Really?
And then sort of woke up to it and felt enormous pressure. And then had to overcome that. And
I mean, Alex is the only one that, she's living in Australia doing something, but the rest of you are pretty tangentially, if not directly involved.
Well, Alex is a graphic artist and which is a kind of writing itself. Yeah, no, I mean, a lot of us are in the quote unquote family business.
Which to me is like the gene pool, and you're all like wildly talented.
Well, thank you for my part, but I mean, it's odd. I think it's.
I was talking about Jack.
John. And Jack. I mean, to say nothing of Jack, the next generation. Yeah,
Jack's my hero. I love that kid.
Yeah, he's great.
This is Jack Mankowitz, who we'll be hearing about in the future.
Jack will be hearing about in the future, and Jack and I have worked together quite a lot, and he's great. So, very talented editor, among other things, documentary editor. I mean, I think it's probably a benefit from the gene perspective more than any other. I don't see any other benefits to it. You know, I think Tom used to say, like, yeah, your name gets you in the door sometimes for meetings. But then you have to produce, and if you can't produce, it's like, then
it'll be short-lived being in the door.
Yeah, Mankowitz schmankowitz, like, this is a crappy screenplay, so you're done.
Yeah. So when you're writing about public figures, you're writing about family members, how did you balance having the book have integrity and worrying about how family members would take what you were saying about either them or their uncle or their father or their... I mean, were you thinking about that when you were writing the book? Did you think about it? What's been the reaction afterwards from your family members?
Crickets.
No,
I'm kidding.
Not really.
No, I'm
this is a talking group. Don't tell me crickets.
No, the reaction.
I know them better.
Yeah, the reaction has been great. Totally great. I didn't think about it. And, for when you're working on something for this long, it was such an albatross that it was embarrassing when any of them would ask me about it. Because for years it felt like, you're not really doing this, are you? And I thought, this is a joke. I mean, I have this contract and I don't think it's ever going to happen. So,
on your tombstone, it'll say almost.
Yeah, like wait till the next draft. So it really took so long. And when I finally woke up and realized, hey, I've got it, then I was more excited about that.
Yeah.
And put aside any worries about, well, what if no one likes it in the family or they have issues with A, B, or C? And there have been a few. There have been some small things that people have, members of the family have said, I think you did X, Y, and Z. So.
And you're saying it's your opinion. It's
Yeah.
not. It's not as
Well,
if.
sure. I mean, that's that. Yeah, it's a portrait. Write your own damn book. I mean, you know. I mean, if
I love that term. I loved that you used portrait, because I don't know whose quote this is. I should look it up, but I love the notion when when a memoirist writes something and somebody starts saying, no, it was 10 o'clock, not 2 o'clock, and mom was wearing green, not black. And the comment is, this is the way it sits in my memory.
right,
The integrity is to my memory,
right,
not
right.
the integrity necessarily to the facts. And I think using
Well, that's
the
it.
term
It's the facts.
portrait.
Yeah, it's the facts versus the truth. You know,
Exactly.
You know, this is my version of the truth, and it's a portrait, and so you can see the brushstrokes, and you know there's an artist behind it who did this painting, and you're not looking at a photograph that was taken by a security camera.
Yeah, that's a good metaphor, Nick.
Thank you. I'll have to for the next edition, the afterword.
So let me close with this. This is a big book with a lot of threads to the story. You could read it as a filmmaker, you could read it as a film buff, you could read it as a historian, you could read it for the pop psychology, for the memoir of everyone. What do you hope the reader feels or comes away with after having read the book?
I hope that readers will really be interested and taken with these two men and be interested in these stories, the stories of their lives, of the people who surrounded them, and come away with, you know, they were storytellers, and this is a story, and there's tons of stories in the book. And I didn't realize until it was done that that was sort of what I most wanted. But I do think that's what I want people to come away and say, well, I feel like I know these guys. Now, you don't even have to like them, but I feel like I know these guys now, and I want to go watch their movies, and I want to learn more about them.
Yeah.
And see if this guy in his portrait, if he got it right. You know, it's entirely possible someone could read this book and then say, well, I want to watch the Fincher movie now, and watch the Fincher movie and think, oh, I like the Fincher movie more. I like that guy. That's a different guy. That's not the same Herman Mankiewicz that Nick Davis was writing about. Now, to those of us in the family, the Fincher movie, whatever its merits, is about somebody's grandfather, but it's not about ours.
Ooh, I like that.
And that's courtesy John Mankiewicz.
Okay, well, you're all, it's very hard for those people who are listening to hang out with any of the Mankowitzes because of the wit. I mean, it's just, which I know now you all inherited. Herman and Joe were as good with the quips. But I think about when I'm with you or Jack or John.
It's good. The question is, where did it come from? Because it didn't come from Franz, and so there is this mystery. Well, like these two guys, like was it their mom? Was she just mocking Franz without anybody realizing it the whole time?
I want Johanna Mankowitz's. I want somebody to write that, to do some homework.
Yeah.
Because the other book that I think could be written is about Sarah.
Yeah.
Because there's a letter in there that Sarah writes to Herman saying, yeah, you stick it to Joe. You know, you let him know that you're like the big dog.
Yeah, that little...
She's not like some little housefrau at home saying, oh, Herman.
Yeah. No. You show him your big contract.
Exactly.
It's like, whoa, go
so
on.
He's a little pisher.
Yeah.
I think she used that language.
She called him a pisher. Yeah, no, that's good. Goma had an edge. I mean, she really did have an edge. Yeah.
So, Nick, I would say to your thoughts on a reader. When I was reading the book, I came away with a comparison. One of my favorite events that we've ever had at R.J. Julia's was Honor Moore, who wrote a book about her grandmother, Margaret Singer Sargent, and Helen Epstein, who wrote a book about her grandmother, who had been a dressmaker in Prague before World War II. But their grandmothers were seen as Margaret Singer Sargent, a drunk, instead of a depressive, brilliant artist. And Helen Epstein's grandmother was known as a victim of the Holocaust and not a brilliant. And I thought about their books a lot when I read this, because I thought, I have a real sense of these men as complicated humans who were wildly talented, made me more interested in them, made me, now I'm going to spend years watching all their films. So, I would say, at least from a population of one, mission accomplished.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
So, Nick, thank you. We've been talking with Nick Davis, the author of Competing with Idiots, Herman and Joe Mankowitz, A Dual Portrait. Nick, thanks so much.
Thank you, Roxanne. This was great.
Fun.
Really fun.